English national identity are the most Eurosceptic. Okay, so there are important territorial and national differences on all of this. This is a first slide. This is data from November 2012. Big N. It's in your pack somewhere. This was a question asked people how you would vote in a in-out referendum on Europe, and this is just people in England. And it was a particularly Eurosceptic sample. People would have voted, 50% of the sample would have voted to get out, 33% would have voted to leave. Okay, so and in retrospect that looks like a particularly Eurosceptic period. But nonetheless, what's interesting about that is that is different from the data in Scotland and indeed Wales. Scotland is basically a kind of mirror image of England very crudely, and Wales is somewhere in the middle, and the kind of demographics probably explain that. But what I've got on this table is how that then relates to people's sense of national identity in England. Okay, and this is one of my favourite slides of all time. It's so stark. I mean, maybe not my favourite result of all time, but it's a lovely slide. So what we have here is, people tend to have kind of overlapping senses of national identity. So there's something called the Moreno scale, so people can feel English and British, or Welsh and British, or whatever. So here we have people with an exclusively English sense of national identity, people with an exclusively British sense of national identity, and kind of various. And what we find here is an incredibly strong relationship between national identity and attitudes to the European Union. And patchy Nigel Farage, and this kind of, waving the Union Jack. The more exclusively British you feel, the more pro-European you are. Take that, Daily Mail. And the more exclusively English you are, the more overwhelmingly hostile you are to European membership. So that is a really strong set of relationships there. So on this kind of measure of just basic attitudes towards the European Union, England looks different and the English look different. Again, looking at national attitudes within the UK towards the European Union. We know that the political class in London differs markedly from the political class in Edinburgh and Cardiff in terms of attitudes to Europe. One hears the Welsh and Scottish First Ministers make kind of pro-European statements of a kind you'd never hear from a UK-level politician, except for the exception that proves the rule, Nick Clegg. He's the only UK-level politician who sounds like a Cardiff or Edinburgh-level politician when they're talking about Europe. But it's not just the political class where you find these distinctions. This is a question which asks people, which level of government do you think has most influence over the way that England is run? Okay, and I think this is a question where England differs from anywhere else that we've got data from. Another 14 regions, nations across Western Europe. Inasmuch as almost 1 in 3 people in England thinks that Europe has most influence over the way that England is run. Okay? And these aren't people who think this is a good thing, by the way. They would vote to get out by about 8 to 1. Okay? Now, we've got comparative data from the rest of lots of other places. It's not strictly comparable because in most places you have an extra layer of government at the regional level. So they're not strictly comparable, but it's interesting to note that nowhere else in Europe, we haven't asked the question in Greece, so maybe that's different, but nowhere else do we find more than about 10% identifying Europe as having this kind of influence. Okay? So there's a hardcore, I would say, around a third of the electorate in England who see Europe as having this incredible influence and view it in wholly baleful, negative terms. Amongst UKIP supporters, 69% of UKIP supporters think that Europe has most influence. And it follows from what I've just told you about national identity. The more strongly exclusively English you feel, the more influence you think Europe has on the governance of England. So there's a really interesting difference there. And then finally moving to UKIP and that measure of Euroscepticism. Now we know from the 3 European elections since '99 that Scotland and Wales are 2 of UKIP's weakest regions. Obviously Scotland's disastrous, and Wales is either 2nd or 3rd weakest for UKIP. And of course, the interesting exception within England is London. And of course, if you've seen the census data, London looks different from the rest of England, because English identity is a bit weaker there and British identity is substantially stronger. What we find, looking at how this is simply national ID by party support. What you see here, and of course obviously I hope with this audience I don't need to explain what the colours mean. What you see here is that UKIP is doing really well, and indeed support is concentrated towards the more exclusively English end of the identity spectrum. Now we don't, as far as I'm aware, John, have good data on UKIP supporters in Scotland. I doubt enough. But in Wales, at least, in Wales, what we find is that UKIP support is concentrated towards people with a more British sense of identity.
Yeah, well,
okay?
you can guess the sentiment.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's
because nationalism has a different.
Yeah, indeed. So in England, UKIP support is concentrated towards people with more exclusively English sense of identity. To the extent there are UKIP supporters in Scotland, and there are some in Wales, obviously, it's towards the more British end of the identity spectrum. Now, so what does all of this mean? I just leave you with 2 thoughts, basically, 2 thoughts. One of which is regards to the European elections next May. Now, having been brought up as a good Calvinistic Methodist, obviously I don't bet. Welsh Calvinistic Methodist don't bet. However, if I were a betting man, my kind of guess for the European result next year would be SNP win in Scotland, Labour win in Wales, UKIP win in England. Okay, now if that is plausible, obviously there's 4 months to run then to the Scottish referendum. Given what John was saying about the impact of UKIP support on the Tories and the potential damage it does for them looking forward to 2015, one does wonder how the Tories in particular would react to a situation where UKIP do really well in the European elections next year. And there is at least some polling evidence in Scotland which suggests that things become very much tighter in that particular race for the referendum if people think that Scottish membership of the European Union is at stake. So it's worth just what does a really strong UKIP performance in the European elections in England mean running forward over the summer of 2012? I don't know, but I just think it's an interesting thing to think about and speculate about. Second point, just looking at UKIP, because one of the things which is emerging now in UKIP is a territorial tension. And it makes perfect sense when you think about the data that I've been showing you. There is a strong group within UKIP which now wants to push for, UKIP is de facto the English National Party, de facto. What if that becomes de jure? What if they actually, name that? What if they actually embrace an English dimension? And we're seeing moves in that direction from Farage at the moment, talking about an English Parliament and so on and so forth. This is creating a reaction, certainly in UKIP Wales. Until now, UKIP Wales has been the tail wagging the UKIP dog on devolution, because UKIP Wales is full of people who hate devolution. They want to get rid of it completely. And indeed, the sitting Welsh UKIP MEP has threatened to leave UKIP if they embrace English devolution. Okay, so there's and if you think about what I said about UKIP in England being more towards the English end of the identity spectrum, in Wales certainly, and probably Scotland towards the more British end of the spectrum, there's potential tension there, maybe something to look for in terms of UKIP as well. But those are kind of speculative thoughts at the end, but I thought you'd like to see the data at least.
Okay, thank you. And now Richard Whitman.
Thank you.
European issues.
Thank you. I will perhaps state the obvious, which is that Europe and the European Union is going to remain grist for the domestic political mill for at least the next 9 months. Obviously through the party season conference, the party season which will focus on the issue of the referendum, which we'll come back to in that referendum, and then through to the EP elections, which we've already spoken about. And despite Cameron's best efforts to sort of pour oil on the waters when it comes to the referendum issue and also for the Europe issue, it's most certainly going to bubble up for both external and internal reasons. And the key external reason is the coronation in the German general election, and Merkel gaining the chancellorship again, and the issue there then being what does she want as regards a European Union level policy and reform agenda for Germany within the European Union. And the Merkel-Cameron relationship has been, I think, one of the most successful strands of the government's European foreign policy. And whether the emergence of a grand coalition after those elections in Germany complicates that, for Cameron, I think will be something interesting to watch. And obviously there have been all sorts of reform proposals which have come through the Social Democrats as well as the Christian Democrats in Germany, which are on issues which the Conservatives would find it quite difficult to accommodate themselves to. So I think the sort of external drivers into domestic politics, I think, are going to be interesting to watch over the next few months and following the settling down coalition formation in Germany. The second issue, which has been touched on by my colleagues, is the European Parliament elections, which are now on the political horizon. And these are always curious exercises, not least for those of us who do the European Union. All of a sudden people get interested, and that happens every 5 years or so. And of course we've got this very dislocated set of results, where we go to the polls, we vote, and then we have to wait a few days to get the results, which I think is obviously a phenomenon of the sort of pan-European voting arrangement. And as my colleagues have already suggested, there's a real frisson, I think, around these European Parliament elections, which I think is going to give them an interest and a salience which they haven't had, certainly from the last 2 occasions, because the stand of UKIP, what UKIP has to stand or lose, and also how those results will be read. But of course, as you'll be well aware, they are very, very difficult elections to cover in terms of the process, very difficult elections to convey to publics, the multi-member constituencies, the party lists, just organising hustings within constituencies such as the South East makes for a very, very crowded stage if you want to have all of the candidates. And all of this, I think, makes for a campaign which is much more likely to focus on the issue of party performance and leadership performance rather than candidates and individuals. And it will obviously be interesting to see the extent to which the in-out referendum in-out UK membership of the EU referendum issue will be true or not on that campaign, because I think, and as I was saying a moment, I think the 3 main parties will have hoped they're part of that by the end of the party season, so it'll be interesting to see the way it plays out in terms of the results that UKIP get. As I've said, it's a curiosity in these elections, or if you're a European elections train spotter, cause of some excitement, is that each of the pan-European parties will be running their campaigns on the back of their candidates for President of the European Commission. And I think it would be very interesting to see how this plays itself out nationally and how far the national political parties plug into this or not. It's more difficult with the Conservatives, of course, because not being in the EPP grouping, and also the sort of group of candidates they might choose from as being the prospective candidate for their political grouping could be interesting. So, I think there's something to watch there in terms of obviously an attempt to sort of personalise the election campaign at the European level, and the extent to which the pan-European groupings will want to work very hard to push their candidate into the UK, and the sort of push back, I think, from the national political parties will be absolutely fascinating. And of course that then in itself, for the European Parliament election, is then a trigger for the sort of reshuffle at the European level, because we have the appointment of a Commission President and then the College of Commissioners to be appointed. And you remember the last occasion on which there was the shuffling of that pack. We had Blair and David Miliband in the pack, both of whom were shuffled out by the end of the game. And I think for this particular cycle, the UK won't have a serious candidate in the game, I think, for a big job, because I think the big jobs look likely to be sewn up, and as Baroness Ashton has indicated, she doesn't want to continue as High Representative for Foreign Policy, and why should she, after the press she's got. There won't be any sort of serious British player, I think, in that particular game. So I think there'll be a different complexion to the discussion in and around that. So finally, to the referendum, I mean, we have a position at the moment where the parties have obviously got separate holding strategies, holding in terms of what they want to present to the electorate, holding in terms of whether they want to have one or not on the referendum, and the Cameron pledge for a post-renegotiation, post-general election referendum pledge, which is now in place, is a clear position, one that's waiting for torpedo by the European Parliament election results. The Clegg position, the Democrat position, I think is still Augustinian. There may be a referendum, but not yet. And I think what it's going to be interesting to watch over the party season is what happens both in Labour and in the Liberal Democrats. For those of you who are motion spotters for debate in the party conferences, the Federal Policy Committee of the Liberal Democrats has put forward a motion which clearly has a backing of the leadership, that the EU Act will act as an inact referendum trigger. In other words, any major reform of the European Union then becomes an inact referendum, which would pretty much put the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats in the same kind of place. So the more interesting story to watch, I think, is the sort of Labour position as it unfolds over the course of the conference, which is either it breaks three ways at the moment, which is obviously either the sort of Trump-Cameron position, which is to offer an inact referendum and offer it earlier, which some might say is balls. The EU Act conversion policy, which is to go down the Liberal Democrat road, which is to treat the EU Act as, in fact, an inact trigger. So if you do have a major reform in the treaties, you then have a trigger under the legislation that currently exists. Or the third position, which is the sort of options open position. It's obviously the position at the moment, which is a sort of hedging strategy. I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see what we get as the outturn by the end of the conference on those streets, because we could have, parties in each of the three parties are broadly aligned in terms of their attitudes towards inact referendums, and then on the back of that, obviously the EP election campaign cranks up, and you get sort of interrogation and offering being somewhat different from each of those positions. So Europe will be interesting, of course.
Okay, we have run quite a long time on presentations, but I know you always like to ask questions and have and have time for questions. So I guess we'll have a bit beyond